The first human ship arrived without ceremony, without herald, without the polite geometry that civilized space had come to expect from newcomers. It emerged from the dark between systems like a scar torn open in the fabric of distance, shedding heat and ionized debris, its hull pitted and asymmetrical, its drives roaring with a violence that made long-range sensors recoil as if struck. To the observers of the Covenant of Many Paths, a loose confederation of species bound by trade, arbitration, and a shared fear of the unknown, the vessel looked less like a work of engineering and more like a survivor that had learned to fly by refusing to die. The Watchers were not warriors. They were clerks, navigators, linguists, and one aging coordinator whose task was to make sense of anomalies before they became emergencies. Their station orbited a pale gas giant at the edge of mapped space, a place chosen for its emptiness, where traffic was light and misunderstandings could be contained. When the alarms flared and the unknown vessel resolved into clarity, the coordinator felt an old tightening behind his eyes. He had seen first contacts before, had smoothed over the jagged edges of fear and pride, had watched civilizations step onto the broader stage with trembling hope. This felt different. The ship did not slow as expected. It did not broadcast the standard mathematical greeting that had become tradition. It simply arrived, engines burning until the last moment, then cut power with abrupt finality. The vessel drifted, scarred plates glowing faintly as they cooled. Scans showed layers upon layers of reinforcement, redundancies piled on redundancies, internal compartments that suggested a design philosophy rooted not in elegance or efficiency, but in endurance. The coordinator ordered a passive hail, a gentle mathematical sequence followed by a conceptual map of the region, an offer of translation protocols. The response came after a delay that stretched nerves thin, a burst of data that was raw, compressed, and almost aggressively direct. It contained linguistic scaffolding, visual references, and a simple declaration rendered in multiple modalities. We are human. We seek passage, trade, and knowledge. We will defend ourselves. There was no poetry in it, no invocation of peace or shared destiny. The bluntness unsettled the observers more than any threat might have. The coordinator authorized a limited reply, welcoming them to the Covenant's periphery and requesting further exchange. As protocols spun up, as translators strained to find rhythm in human syntax, the coordinator studied the ship's silhouette again. He wondered what kind of space could have shaped such a thing, what kind of history could have taught a species to announce itself with such unadorned resolve. The human vessel carried within it a record of scars, not merely physical but cultural. Its crew had not been selected for diplomacy. They were navigators who had crossed unstable regions, engineers who had learned to coax function from failing systems, medics who had practiced their art under conditions that would have broken others. Their leader was not titled in a way the Covenant recognized. Human hierarchy was fluid, situational, and often informal. Authority rested on competence proven under pressure. The one who spoke for them did so because the others trusted that voice to hold steady when things went wrong. As data flowed, misunderstandings surfaced immediately. The Covenant's expectations of gradual integration clashed with human urgency. Humans spoke of threats beyond their charts, of regions where space itself seemed hostile, where entities of uncertain nature tested the limits of physics and sanity. The Covenant had heard rumors of such things, dismissed them as exaggerations from fringe explorers. Yet the human ship bore evidence of encounters that could not be easily explained away. Hull deformations suggested forces that ignored conventional shielding. Radiation signatures hinted at phenomena that rewrote the rules of exposure. The Covenant observers exchanged uneasy glances across species and lifespans. Trade talks began in earnest, tentative, and careful. Humans offered materials forged under extreme conditions, alloys that retained strength after repeated stress, techniques for modular construction that allowed rapid repair. In return, they sought star maps, political realities, and above all knowledge. Not weapons, not alliances, but understanding. This too was unsettling. Most newcomers sought protection or power. Humans seemed driven by a need to know what lay ahead, as if ignorance itself were an enemy they could not afford to tolerate. The coordinator arranged for a delegation to meet the humans in person aboard the Covenant station. The decision was controversial. Some argued for distance, for remote exchange until more was known. Others sensed opportunity. In the end, caution and curiosity balanced each other, and a small group crossed the gap between station and ship. The human vessel's interior was utilitarian, corridors wide enough to move equipment quickly, surfaces worn smooth by constant use. There were no grand halls, no art displayed for impression. Instead, there were marks, scratches, notes etched into panels, reminders of repairs made and crises survived. It felt lived in, not curated. The human representatives did not bow or perform elaborate greetings. They met eyes where eyes existed and nodded. Their posture was relaxed but alert, a readiness that never quite turned off. Conversation flowed haltingly at first, translation imperfect, cultural assumptions colliding. Yet beneath the friction there was a surprising compatibility. Humans valued clear terms, mutual benefit, and above all reliability. They did not promise what they could not deliver. They did not hide their limits. This honesty, born perhaps of hard lessons, resonated with some members of the Covenant who had grown weary of performative diplomacy. As days passed, the human presence became a topic of intense discussion across the Covenant. Some saw them as potential destabilizers, a species too accustomed to adversity to fit comfortably into a system built on balance and restraint. Others saw resilience where they had once seen fragility, a reminder that survival could take many forms. Reports filtered in from other outposts as additional human ships appeared, not in great numbers, but enough to suggest a slow, deliberate expansion. Each ship bore its own scars, its own variations on the same stubborn design philosophy. The turning point came not through negotiation, but through crisis. A long-dormant anomaly near the station flared to life, a gravitational distortion that threatened to tear the station from orbit and scatter its inhabitants into the gas giant below. Covenant technology responded as designed, stabilizers firing, protocols executing, but the anomaly did not behave as expected. It shifted, adapted, as if reacting to the attempts to contain it. Panic rippled through the station. Evacuation plans were dusted off, though few believed they would suffice. The humans did not wait for permission. Their ship powered up, engines straining against the distortion. They broadcast a brief message, not a request, but a statement of intent. They had seen something like this before, though never exactly the same. They proposed a solution that bordered on reckless by Covenant standards, a direct intervention using their ship's mass and drive output to counter the anomaly long enough for the station to stabilize and adjust orbit. It was dangerous. It risked the human ship's destruction. The Covenant hesitated, calculations running, probabilities flashing red. Before a consensus could be reached, the human vessel moved. It plunged toward the heart of the distortion, hull groaning as forces twisted around it. The station's sensors screamed with data as the humans executed maneuvers that violated accepted safety margins. Inside the human ship, alarms blared, crew braced, hands steady on controls that vibrated with barely contained power. They had practiced this kind of madness, had learned where the line lay between daring and death, and how to dance along it without falling. The effect was immediate. The anomaly wavered, its growth checked by the unexpected resistance. The station systems seized the opportunity, stabilizers recalibrating, orbit shifting by precious degrees. Minutes stretched into an eternity of strain. Then, with a final shudder, the distortion collapsed, dissipating into harmless fluctuations. The human ship emerged battered, several sections scorched and warped, but intact. Cheers erupted across the station, spontaneous and heartfelt, cutting through linguistic barriers. In the aftermath, as damage was assessed and gratitude expressed, something fundamental shifted. The Covenant had witnessed not just technical competence, but a willingness to act decisively for others, at great risk, without assurance of reward. Humans did not frame their actions as heroic. When thanked, their representatives simply stated that mutual survival was efficient and that leaving the station to its fate would have created more problems later. Yet behind the pragmatic phrasing, the Covenant sensed a deeper truth. Humans had internalized adversity to such an extent that confronting it on behalf of others felt natural. The coordinator, watching repair crews work side by side with human engineers, felt a cautious hope take root. He had seen alliances forged through shared interest and broken by shifting power. This felt different. It felt like the beginning of a relationship shaped by tested trust. The human ship, scarred and new, docked for repairs, its presence no longer an anomaly but a catalyst. As the Covenant recorded the incident for posterity, debates began anew, now tinged with respect and concern. Humanity had arrived, not with songs or banners, but with unyielding hands ready to grasp the universe and refuse to let go. In the weeks following the containment of the anomaly, the station settled into a rhythm that felt subtly altered, as if an unseen gear had been replaced with one cut from a different metal. Human engineers moved through corridors once reserved for Covenant maintenance teams, their presence marked not by ceremony, but by the sound of tools and the smell of scorched insulation. They worked with a focus that bordered on stubbornness, often refusing rest, until systems were not merely functional but reinforced against future failure. To many Covenant observers, this approach seemed excessive. Systems were designed with margins that reflected accepted risk models. Humans appeared to operate under a different assumption entirely, one that treated failure not as a possibility to be minimized, but as an inevitability to be survived. Cultural exchange followed necessity. As repairs progressed, shared spaces became sites of cautious conversation. Humans ate communally, favoring dense foods engineered for efficiency rather than pleasure, though they did not object when Covenant hosts introduced local equivalents. They listened more than they spoke, absorbing information about trade routes, political tensions, and historical compromises that had shaped the Covenant's cautious expansion. When they did speak, their questions cut to practical consequences. What happened when treaties failed? How disputes escalated despite arbitration? Which regions were considered stable only because no one had tested them recently? The coordinator, tasked now with integrating humans into ongoing frameworks, found himself revising long-standing assumptions. The Covenant prized balance, believing that stability arose from carefully maintained equivalence among powers. Humans spoke instead of thresholds. They described lines that, once crossed, demanded response regardless of balance. This mindset was born from a history the Covenant only gradually began to understand. Fragmentary records shared by the humans painted a picture of a species forged not by a single catastrophe, but by a relentless series of challenges, each leaving scars that became lessons. Environmental collapse narrowly averted internal conflicts that threatened extinction, technological leaps that outpaced wisdom and forced rapid adaptation. Survival had never been guaranteed. It had been negotiated daily. As trust grew, humans were granted limited access to Covenant archives. What they found unsettled them. Vast regions of mapped space were marked with warnings that lacked specificity, hazards categorized by probability rather than by consequence. Entire corridors avoided not because they were impassable, but because they were inconvenient to stabilize. Humans cross-referenced these with their own charts, sparse and hard-won, and identified overlaps that made their representatives uneasy. They began to suspect that the threats they had encountered on the fringe were not isolated anomalies, but symptoms of a larger pattern the Covenant had learned to skirt rather than confront. The first joint expedition was proposed almost casually during a discussion about navigation updates. A human navigator pointed out a region where trade lanes curved around an area of unstable readings. The Covenant explanation was standard: fluctuations, unpredictable, not worth the cost of detailed survey. The human response was equally simple: instability left unmeasured tended to grow. The suggestion was to send a small, reinforced vessel to probe the region, gather data, and retreat if necessary. The Covenant hesitated, citing precedent and risk. The humans countered with an offer to aid, using their own ship, with Covenant observers aboard. Debate followed, intense but measured. Ultimately, curiosity and a lingering sense of obligation tipped the balance. The human ship departed the station accompanied by a lighter Covenant craft, its crew composed of scientists and analysts unaccustomed to operating so close to potential danger. As the vessels approached the unstable region, sensors registered distortions similar to those seen near the station, though less intense. Space itself seemed to ripple, distances elongating and compressing in ways that defied intuitive geometry. The Covenant craft slowed, protocols urging caution. The human ship maintained course, adjusting vectors in rapid, almost instinctive corrections. Within the human vessel, tension was familiar rather than paralyzing. Crew members moved with practiced efficiency, securing loose equipment, recalibrating instruments on the fly. They spoke in clipped exchanges that conveyed intent without excess. To the Covenant observers, monitoring from their own ship, it looked chaotic. To the humans, it was controlled improvisation, the art of working within uncertainty without surrendering initiative. The source of the instability revealed itself gradually. At the heart of the region floated a structure, immense and irregular, its surface a lattice of interlocking forms that absorbed and redirected energy. It did not conform to known construction methods. It did not broadcast signals or respond to scans in predictable ways. It simply existed, exerting influence on the surrounding spacetime. Covenant records contained no mention of such an object, though vague references to ancient remnants surfaced in mythic archives. The humans, confronted with the unknown, did not speculate about origin. They focused on effect. As the ships approached, the structure reacted. Energy patterns shifted, gravitational gradients spiked. The Covenant craft began to experience system lag, its more delicate components struggling to compensate. The human ship surged forward, positioning itself between the structure and its companion. Power was rerouted, shields reinforced beyond nominal limits. The structure emitted a pulse that rattled both vessels, a probing touch rather than an attack. Data flooded sensors, overwhelming in volume but rich in detail. The humans did not retreat. They adjusted. Drives flared, not to escape, but to maintain relative position. The Covenant observers watched in disbelief as the human ship absorbed stresses that should have torn it apart, its layered hull flexing and redistributing force. Within moments, the structure's activity diminished, as if recognizing resistance. The pulse ceased. The surrounding space began to stabilize, though not completely. The message was clear even without translation. Interaction elicited response. Data analysis occupied the return journey. The structure appeared to be part of a network, dormant nodes scattered across regions the Covenant had labeled unstable. Each exerted subtle influence, enough to discourage traffic, but insufficient to provoke investigation. Over time, these influences compounded, warping trade routes and isolating systems. The Covenant had adapted by avoidance, inadvertently allowing the network to persist and perhaps grow. The humans interpreted this not as a mystery to be revered, but as a problem to be solved. Back at the station, revelations sparked debate that eclipsed previous discussions. Some Covenant members argued that disturbing such structures risked awakening forces beyond comprehension. Others acknowledged that passive avoidance had not prevented danger, merely deferred it. The humans spoke sparingly, presenting data without embellishment. Their conclusion was blunt. The structures responded to engagement. Ignoring them ceded initiative to an unknown system. Understanding required contact, measured but deliberate. Political ramifications rippled outward. Neighboring polities within the Covenant questioned the wisdom of continued cooperation with humans, fearing entanglement in conflicts not of their making. Yet reports of the station's survival and the expedition's success could not be dismissed. Trade partners began requesting human involvement in infrastructure reinforcement. Insurance guilds recalculated risk models to account for human intervention. A subtle shift occurred as humans transitioned from anomaly to asset. Not all reactions were positive. Within the Covenant, factions arose that viewed human philosophy as destabilizing. They argued that endurance born of hardship was not universally admirable, that it could lead to escalation rather than harmony. Humans responded by acknowledging the risk without apology. They did not claim moral superiority. They claimed experience. When pressed on whether their approach would invite greater threats, a human representative replied that threats already existed and that pretending otherwise did not make them kinder. As weeks turned to months, additional human ships arrived, each integrating into the growing web of cooperation. They shared refinements to shielding, modular repair techniques, and training methods that emphasized adaptability. Covenant crews who trained alongside humans found their own practices evolving. Drills became less scripted, more responsive. Failure scenarios expanded beyond acceptable parameters. Some found this unsettling, others found it empowering. The coordinator observed these changes with mixed emotions. Stability, the Covenant's guiding principle, was being redefined. Where once stability meant minimizing disturbance, it now began to include resilience, the capacity to absorb shocks and continue. Humans embodied this concept not as an abstract ideal, but as a lived reality. Their presence challenged complacency, forced reconsideration of long-held truths. The coordinator suspected that this was only the beginning. Reports soon arrived from distant outposts of similar structures being encountered, some newly active, others long ignored. In several cases, Covenant installations faced disruptions eerily reminiscent of the station's near disaster. Where humans were present, responses were swift and decisive. Where they were not, damage mounted. Patterns emerged too clear to ignore. The network was not static. It was adjusting, perhaps in response to increased observation. The realization settled heavily across the Covenant. The universe was more reactive than they had believed. Their models, built on equilibrium, failed to account for systems that interpreted avoidance as opportunity. Humanity, by virtue of its history, recognized this instinctively. They had evolved in an environment where passivity invited extinction. Their strength was not aggression, but refusal to be shaped solely by external forces. As preparations began for a broader initiative to map and engage the network of structures, humans were invited not merely as participants, but as planners. The invitation marked a profound shift in status. From newcomers seeking passage, they had become partners in confronting a shared unknown. Acceptance was not universal, but momentum was undeniable. On the human ship that had first arrived, repairs from the anomaly encounter were finally complete. New scars joined old, each recorded not as blemish, but as data. The crew gathered in their utilitarian common space, reviewing projections of regions yet unexplored. There was no speech to mark the moment, no declaration of destiny. Only a shared understanding that the universe had revealed a challenge, and that turning away was not an option they recognized. Beyond the station's windows, space stretched vast and indifferent, threaded now with questions that could no longer be ignored. The Covenant stood at a crossroads between comfort and growth, caution and courage. Humanity, unyielding hands scarred by countless trials, reached forward not to dominate, but to brace, to hold fast against forces that would erode all things left unattended. The measure of that grip, and whether it would be enough, remained to be seen. The initiative to confront the network did not begin with grand fleets or declarations. It began with logistics, with arguments over fuel allocations, with translators struggling to reconcile terminologies that reflected fundamentally different worldviews. The Covenant had always approached expansion as an exercise in optimization, minimizing loss while maximizing reach. Humans framed the problem differently. They spoke of pressure points, of systems whose failure would cascade outward, of the danger inherent in assuming that unknown structures were inert simply because they had not yet acted decisively. The resulting plans were messy compromises, layered with contingencies that satisfied Covenant caution and human insistence on readiness. The first coordinated operation targeted a region where 3 trade corridors converged, all subtly warped by nearby distortions. Traffic through the area had slowed over decades, ships compensating unconsciously for navigational drift. Economic models had absorbed the inefficiency as background noise. Humans flagged the region as a likely node, a place where multiple influences intersected. A task group assembled, small by Covenant standards but heavily instrumented. Human ships formed the core, their reinforced hulls and adaptable systems complemented by Covenant sensor platforms and analytical craft. As the group advanced, space grew increasingly restless, distances misbehaved, signals echoed with strange delays. Covenant crews grew uneasy, their instruments offering data that fit no established category. Human crews adjusted, cross-checking readings against experiential heuristics developed in environments where instruments lied as often as they told truth. The contrast was stark. Covenant analysis sought to classify before acting. Humans acted to refine classification. The node revealed itself as a cluster of structures rather than a single entity, arranged in a loose configuration that suggested intentional design. Energy flowed between them in pulses, a slow rhythm that resonated with the distortions felt throughout the region. When the task group crossed an invisible threshold, the pulses quickened. The cluster responded as a system aware of intrusion, though not necessarily hostile. Covenant analysts debated semantics even as alarms flared. Humans recognized the pattern from prior encounters. Response preceded understanding. The engagement was not a battle in any conventional sense. There were no weapons exchanged, no targeting solutions. Instead, it was a contest of influence. The structures emitted fields that strained hulls and scrambled sensors. Human ships countered with bursts of calibrated energy, not to damage, but to disrupt coherence. Covenant platforms fed data in real time, their superior analytical capacity mapping interactions faster than human intuition alone could manage. The synergy was imperfect, but promising. At one point, a Covenant craft lagged, its propulsion destabilized by a sudden surge from the cluster. Before commands could be issued, a human ship broke formation, interposing itself to absorb the worst of the effect. The maneuver was costly, systems overloaded, compartments lost pressure, yet the Covenant craft stabilized, its crew spared. The incident reverberated through the task group, reinforcing a lesson already taking root. Humans prioritized collective survival even when it endangered them, not from altruism alone, but from a belief that fragmented effort ensured failure. Gradually, the cluster's activity diminished. Energy flows slowed, then rerouted inward. The distortions eased, trade corridors straightening perceptibly. Sensors recorded changes that would take months to fully analyze. The task group withdrew, battered but intact. In the aftermath, debates erupted across the Covenant. Some hailed the operation as proof that engagement reduced risk. Others warned that provoking the network might escalate responses elsewhere. Humans acknowledged the uncertainty. They also pointed out that the network had been escalating quietly for centuries, unchallenged. News of the operation spread faster than official channels could manage. Independent traders reported smoother passages through previously unreliable routes. Insurance rates dipped. Skeptics took note. Requests for human collaboration increased, sometimes bypassing Covenant bureaucracy entirely. This created tension. Established powers within the Covenant worried about erosion of authority. Humans, for their part, showed little interest in political leverage. They accepted contracts that aligned with their assessment of broader stability and declined others without apology. The most profound changes occurred not in policy chambers, but in training halls. Covenant crews exposed to human methodologies began adapting them. Simulations grew harsher, scenarios less predictable. Emphasis shifted from perfect execution to recovery under duress. This cultural blade through unsettled traditionalists. The Covenant had long equated professionalism with composure, the appearance of control. Humans demonstrated that control could coexist with visible strain, that acknowledging stress did not negate competence. Resistance coalesced around a faction that argued the Covenant was losing its identity, trading refinement for brute persistence. They pointed to human ships as inelegant, to their tactics as crude. They warned that reliance on human resilience masked deeper vulnerabilities. Humans listened to these critiques without defensiveness. Some even agreed in part, conceding that endurance was not a substitute for foresight. Yet they countered that foresight untested by hardship tended toward illusion. The debate reached a flashpoint when a distant Covenant world experienced a sudden destabilization event. A structure previously catalogued as dormant surged, tearing at orbital infrastructure. Local defenses faltered, communications lagged. By the time distress signals propagated, damage was extensive. The Covenant convened emergency councils, deliberations slowed by procedural requirements. Humans did not wait. A small flotilla diverted mid-transit, pushing drives beyond safe margins to arrive within hours rather than days. What they found was chaos. The structure's influence had grown more aggressive, its fields disrupting not only machinery but biological systems. Evacuation was underway, but hampered by unpredictable surges. Human ships plunged into the maelstrom, their crews working in conditions that would have grounded most Covenant operations. They adapted shielding to protect evacuees, reconfigured cargo bays into triage centers, and coordinated with local authorities whose plans had never accounted for such interference. The cost was high. One human ship suffered catastrophic damage, its hull breached beyond immediate repair. The crew evacuated into others under fire from environmental forces that made rescue perilous. They succeeded through relentless coordination and refusal to abandon those still alive. When the structure finally subsided, pushed into quiescence by sustained interference, the world was scarred but saved. Casualties were significant, but far lower than projections had feared. The aftermath was sobering. Memorials were held across species, honoring losses that transcended origin. The damaged human ship was beyond salvage. Its remains were recovered as best they could be, data cores preserved, personal effects returned. Humans did not frame the loss as tragedy alone. They catalogued failures, updated designs, and redistributed lessons learned. Grief was present, heavy and real, but it did not paralyze. It fueled refinement. The Covenant could no longer deny the pattern. Where humans engaged, outcomes improved. Where protocol delayed response, damage compounded. This realization forced a reckoning. Councils streamlined emergency authority. Joint command structures were formalized, pairing Covenant strategic oversight with human operational leadership in crisis scenarios. It was an unprecedented concession, born not of deference but of evidence. Still, unease lingered. Some questioned whether humanity's approach would scale, whether constant engagement would provoke the network into unified resistance. Humans admitted the possibility. They also noted that inaction had already allowed the network to entrench itself. Their philosophy was not reckless confrontation, but informed pressure, applied where it mattered most, backed by willingness to absorb consequences. As mapping expanded, patterns within the network became clearer. The structures were not uniform. Some appeared ancient, others newer, as if constructed or activated in phases. Their responses varied, suggesting limited autonomy rather than centralized control. This complexity intrigued Covenant scholars and unsettled them in equal measure. Humans viewed it as an opportunity. Systems with internal variation could be disrupted through targeted strategies rather than overwhelming force. On the original station, now a hub of joint operations, the coordinator reflected on how far events had moved beyond his initial anxieties. He had feared human unpredictability. Instead, he had encountered a different kind of order, one that accepted chaos as a constant and sought to function within it. The Covenant's identity was evolving, not dissolving. Balance was no longer static. It was dynamic, maintained through continual adjustment. Humans remained themselves. They did not adopt Covenant aesthetics or rhetoric. Their ships stayed rugged, their language direct, yet they learned too. Covenant analytical frameworks refined human intuition. Long-view modeling tempered impulse. The partnership was uneven, sometimes strained, but undeniably productive. Far beyond the mapped regions, faint shifts rippled through the network. Structures adjusted, some withdrawing influence, others intensifying. It was unclear whether this represented adaptation or alarm. What was clear was that the universe had taken notice of humanity's refusal to skirt the edges of danger. The contest had moved from avoidance to interaction. In quiet moments between deployments, human crews shared stories, not of conquest but of persistence. Worlds saved imperfectly, lessons paid for dearly, comrades lost but not forgotten. Covenant listeners began to understand that this narrative was not unique to spacefaring humans. It was the extension of a long history of confronting environments that did not care whether they survived. Chapter 3 closed not with resolution, but with acceleration. The Covenant and humanity stood committed to a path that promised neither safety nor simplicity. Ahead lay deeper nodes, stronger reactions, questions about origin and intent that might never be fully answered. Yet there was a shared conviction, now fragile but real, that standing still was the most dangerous choice of all. Momentum changed the nature of fear. Where once the Covenant had feared disruption above all else, it now feared stagnation more keenly, the slow erosion of systems left unattended. This shift did not eliminate anxiety, it redistributed it. Councils debated not whether to engage the network, but where and how aggressively. Humans were no longer the lone advocates of pressure. They had become a reference point, a standard against which proposed actions were measured. This visibility carried weight, and with its scrutiny, the next phase of engagement revealed a truth that unsettled even the humans. The network was not merely reactive. In several regions, structures began altering behavior in anticipation of human patterns. Distortions manifested earlier, before task groups arrived. Energy signatures shifted away from previously mapped responses. It was adaptation, not random fluctuation. Covenant analysts presented models showing iterative change, as if the network were learning. The implication was profound. Whatever intelligence underlay the structures, whether centralized or emergent, it was no longer passive. This revelation fractured consensus. One bloc argued that continued probing risked accelerating an arms race with an unknown adversary. Another countered that withdrawal would signal vulnerability, encouraging further expansion of influence. Humans listened, their expressions grim. They had encountered adaptive threats before, though never on such a scale. Their experience suggested that adaptation was not inherently escalation. It was communication of a sort. The question was whether the network's adaptations were defensive, exploratory, or preparatory. A pivotal incident forced the issue. A mid-range system, lightly populated and economically modest, experienced a sudden surge that disrupted its star's output, destabilizing planetary climates within days. Covenant response teams mobilized but found access routes distorted beyond safe limits. Humans proposed an unconventional solution, using their ships to create temporary corridors through the distortion by brute force stabilization, effectively carving paths where space refused to cooperate. The plan was dangerous, resource-intensive, and offered no guarantee of success. Without it, the system faced long-term collapse. Authorization was granted under emergency powers that would have been unthinkable a cycle earlier. Human ships deployed in pairs, reinforcing each other as they drove into the warped region. The effort taxed their drives to near failure. Hulls glowed, systems screamed, crews rotated through stations to manage exhaustion. Covenant observers monitored with a mixture of awe and dread. This was not precision, it was endurance applied at scale. The corridors held long enough for relief convoys to pass. Stabilization arrays were deployed around the star, mitigating the worst fluctuations. Lives were saved, ecosystems preserved in partial form. The cost was severe. 2 human ships were crippled, their frames twisted beyond repair. Crews evacuated under conditions that would have been fatal without practiced coordination. Covenant vessels assisted, their captains making split-second decisions that defied prior training but mirrored human improvisation. In the aftermath, a pattern emerged. The network's response to the corridor creation was muted, almost cautious. Structures nearby reduced activity, as if assessing the implications. Analysts debated whether this indicated deterrence or recalibration. Humans were wary of premature conclusions. They noted that the network seemed less interested in destruction than in shaping behavior, nudging traffic and development along preferred paths. It was influence rather than annihilation. This insight reframed the conflict. If the network sought to shape space through persistent pressure, then humanity's resistance represented not defiance alone, but counter-shaping. The Covenant had long shaped space through agreements and infrastructure, imposing order through consensus. The network did so through physics itself, embedding constraints into reality. Humans, accustomed to environments that resisted them, recognized the contest instinctively. Philosophical debates intensified. Was the network a remnant of an ancient civilization attempting to preserve a long-dead order? Was it an automated system pursuing goals long divorced from context? Or was it something stranger, an emergent phenomenon arising from the interactions of matter and energy on scales poorly understood? Humans were less concerned with categorization than with leverage. Understanding mattered insofar as it informed action. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A Covenant researcher, working alongside human engineers, identified a correlation between human drive emissions and subtle shifts in network behavior. Human drives, designed to function under chaotic conditions, produced fluctuations that interfered with the structure's fields in complex ways. Not outright disruption, but noise. The network's influence relied on coherence. Human presence introduced unpredictability. This discovery reframed human resilience as more than passive toughness. It was an active variable, an irritant to systems optimized for predictability. The implication was unsettling. Humanity's very nature, its improvisational adaptability, might be incompatible with the network's mode of control. This did not guarantee victory. It suggested incompatibility that could escalate if not managed carefully. Strategies evolved. Rather than direct confrontation everywhere, mixed task groups began seeding regions with human-operated probes and stations, introducing controlled unpredictability. The effect was subtle but measurable. Distortions softened, trade routes stabilized without full-scale intervention. The network appeared to divert influence elsewhere, perhaps seeking easier leverage. This validated human assertions that pressure need not be constant to be effective. Strategic presence mattered. Not all outcomes were positive. In one region, a structure reacted violently to the introduction of human systems, unleashing a surge that overwhelmed local defenses. Losses were heavy. Investigations suggested that the structure was of a different class, less tolerant of interference. Humans acknowledged the miscalculation. They withdrew from similar nodes pending further study. Adaptation cut both ways. Political ramifications followed. Some Covenant members accused humans of provoking disasters through reckless experimentation. Others countered that without experimentation, vulnerabilities would remain hidden until exploited catastrophically. The debate was no longer about whether humans belonged, but about how much influence they should wield. Power dynamics shifted as systems under human protection prospered, while others lagged. Within humanity, introspection grew. They had entered the Covenant seeking knowledge and passage, not leadership. Now they found themselves shaping strategy across species. Some worried about overextension, about becoming a focal point for blame as well as praise. Yet retreat felt dishonest. Their history offered no examples of safety gained through withdrawal from existential challenges. A human council convened aboard a mobile habitat, representatives from various fleets and settlements attending via secure links. The discussion was raw, unadorned. They debated limits, responsibilities, and the risk of becoming what they opposed, imposing their will without consent. The conclusion was cautious but firm. They would continue, but with transparency. Decisions would be shared, failures acknowledged publicly, authority distributed rather than centralized. This approach resonated with segments of the Covenant weary of opaque power. Joint oversight committees were formed, blending human pragmatism with Covenant deliberation. The process was imperfect, slower than humans preferred, faster than some Covenant factions found comfortable. Yet it created buy-in, a sense that the struggle was collective rather than imposed. Meanwhile, the network continued to shift. New distortions appeared at the edges of mapped space, probing regions with minimal presence. Humans flagged these as tests. The Covenant agreed to respond selectively, establishing outposts designed less as fortresses and more as adaptive anchors. These installations incorporated human modularity and Covenant analytical systems, embodying the synthesis taking shape. On one such outpost, a human engineer and a Covenant theorist spent long cycles refining models that treated space not as a static backdrop, but as a contested medium. Their work suggested that the network's ultimate limitation lay in its dependence on long-term consistency. It could shape slowly, inexorably, but struggled with rapid, uneven change. Humanity thrived in such conditions. This realization did not inspire triumph. It inspired humility. The universe was vast, and the network only one of its many expressions. Humanity's strength lay not in dominance, but in endurance and adaptability. The Covenant's strength lay in collective memory and restraint. Together, they formed a counterweight not by overpowering the unknown, but by refusing to be simplified by it. Chapter 4 closed with the first signs that the network's expansion had stalled in several key regions. Trade flowed more freely. Systems once isolated reconnected. The cost remained high, measured in lost ships and strained alliances. Yet the trajectory had changed. The universe, once content to nudge civilizations into narrow channels, now encountered resistance that was messy, persistent, and unwilling to fade quietly into the margins. Stall did not mean retreat. The network's influence, though blunted in several corridors, began manifesting in more intricate ways. Where once distortions had been broad and impersonal, now they appeared targeted, localized around hubs of cooperation between humans and the Covenant. Communication delays spiked unpredictably. Supply chains experienced failures that defied conventional sabotage models. It was as if the network had shifted from shaping space itself to shaping behavior indirectly, applying pressure where coordination mattered most. This evolution forced a re-evaluation of assumptions. Covenant analysts, long accustomed to modeling systems with identifiable incentives, struggled to map intent onto something that operated without obvious self-preservation or expansionist markers. Humans, for their part, recognized a familiar pattern. On their homeworld, complex failures had rarely come from singular disasters. They had come from cascading interactions, from systems stressed just enough to push human institutions toward fracture. The network, whether by design or emergent logic, appeared to be doing the same on an interstellar scale. The first serious fracture occurred within the Covenant itself. A coalition of member polities announced a temporary withdrawal from joint operations, citing economic strain and unacceptable risk. They sealed their borders, rerouted traffic, and suspended shared infrastructure agreements. The move was legal under Covenant charters, but its timing was disastrous. The regions they withdrew from lay adjacent to several active nodes. Within cycles, distortions intensified there, trade faltered, and local economies suffered. The coalition accused joint strategy of provoking the response. Others accused the coalition of creating a vacuum the network exploited. Humans found themselves in an uncomfortable position. They had argued against unilateral withdrawal, but respected the Covenant's principles of autonomy. Now they faced a dilemma. Intervening in the coalition's space without invitation risked political rupture. Not intervening risked humanitarian collapse that would ripple outward. Debate within human councils was fierce. Some advocated decisive action regardless of consent, arguing that physics did not respect borders. Others warned that imposing help would undermine the very cooperation they sought to preserve. The compromise was subtle. Human vessels did not cross borders. Instead, they stationed themselves at the edges, stabilizing distortions before they propagated inward. They shared data openly, broadcasting models and forecasts that showed likely outcomes if the coalition maintained isolation. They offered technical assistance without condition. It was a strategy of presence without intrusion, pressure without coercion. The network responded in an unexpected way. Distortions near the borders fluctuated erratically, as if probing for weakness. Some surged, only to recede when human ships adjusted positions. Others bypassed the stabilized edges entirely, manifesting deeper within coalition space. This suggested that the network was capable of strategic circumvention, not merely brute influence. The implication was sobering. No perimeter could be perfectly sealed. Isolation did not equate to safety. Within the coalition, internal debate intensified. Systems hardest hit pushed leadership to reconsider withdrawal. Others doubled down, framing hardship as the cost of independence. Humans watched with grim familiarity. They had lived through similar cycles of denial and fragmentation in their own past. They did not gloat. They prepared contingency plans for refugee flows and infrastructure collapse, quietly coordinating with Covenant partners willing to act if invited. The invitation came sooner than expected. A major habitat within coalition space suffered a cascading failure when a localized distortion disrupted life support regulation. Emergency systems held, but only barely. Coalition authorities issued a narrowly worded request for assistance, careful to preserve political face. Humans responded immediately, dispatching a mixed fleet that included Covenant vessels to underscore legitimacy. The intervention was tense but effective. Human crews integrated with local teams, adapting on the fly to unfamiliar systems. Covenant analysts coordinated resource allocation, smoothing bureaucratic obstacles that might have slowed response. The habitat stabilized, lives were saved. The coalition's narrative shifted, reluctantly acknowledging that engagement had mitigated rather than caused the crisis. This episode marked a turning point. The myth of safe withdrawal lost credibility. The Covenant began revising its charters to account for threats that transcended political boundaries, granting provisional authority for joint intervention under clearly defined conditions. It was not a surrender of sovereignty, but a recognition that certain forces operated at scales where traditional autonomy became porous. Meanwhile, deeper analysis of network behavior yielded disturbing insights. Patterns suggested that the network's ultimate objective might not be control in the conventional sense, but optimization. It appeared to minimize complexity in its environment, smoothing variability, channeling development along stable trajectories. Civilizations that adapted to its constraints persisted, albeit constrained. Those that resisted introduced noise, inefficiency, and unpredictability. Humanity embodied all three. This framed the conflict in stark terms. From the network's perspective, humanity was not an enemy but an anomaly, a destabilizing element that refused to settle into predictable patterns. Its response was not malice, but correction. This interpretation unsettled the Covenant profoundly. They had always believed themselves to be agents of order. Now they faced the possibility that the universe itself enforced a form of order that did not require consent. Humans reacted with a mix of grim humor and resolve. They had long suspected that the universe was indifferent to comfort. If the network represented a natural tendency toward homogenization, then resistance was not rebellion but diversity asserting itself. They did not romanticize the struggle. Optimization was powerful because it was efficient. Noise required constant effort to sustain. Effort intensified. Joint research initiatives explored ways to amplify unpredictability without causing harm. Human engineers experimented with drive modulation patterns that introduced benign variance into spacetime metrics. Covenant scientists modeled how cultural and economic diversity correlated with resilience against network influence. The results suggested that heterogeneity itself was a shield. Monocultures, whether biological, technological, or political, were more susceptible to optimization pressures. This insight reshaped policy. The Covenant began encouraging diversity of design rather than standardization. Redundant systems were built differently rather than identically. Trade agreements incentivized multiple supply chains. Humans supported these shifts enthusiastically. They had learned the hard way that single points of failure were invitations to disaster. Losses continued. A remote outpost vanished entirely, swallowed by a distortion that collapsed before rescue could arrive. Investigations found no warning, no anomaly beyond a sudden spike. The randomness chilled even human optimism. They acknowledged openly that some losses were unavoidable. The goal was not to prevent all harm, but to ensure that harm did not propagate unchecked. Through it all, human demeanor remained stubbornly grounded. They did not frame themselves as saviors. They recorded mistakes meticulously. When criticized, they responded with data rather than rhetoric. This consistency earned a grudging respect even among skeptics. Reliability, more than heroism, became humanity's defining trait within the Covenant. As the network adapted, so did resistance. The conflict settled into a tense equilibrium, neither side achieving decisive advantage. Yet subtle metrics favored the coalition of species. Growth stabilized. Catastrophic events decreased in frequency, if not severity. The universe remained dangerous, but less constraining. Humanity's presence had not eliminated risk. It had redistributed it, preventing accumulation in hidden corners. Chapter 5 closed on an uneasy plateau. No declarations of victory were made. Instead, there was recognition of a long struggle, one measured not in battles won, but in futures kept open. The Covenant and humanity stood bound not by ideology, but by shared exposure to a universe that resisted simplification. Their unyielding hands did not seek to reshape everything they touched. They sought instead to keep hold of possibility, even when the effort left scars that would never fully fade. Time did what neither the Covenant nor humanity could fully control. It stretched the conflict into something less dramatic and more revealing. The network did not surge again in a single overwhelming motion, nor did it collapse under sustained resistance. Instead, it settled into the background of existence, a persistent pressure that shaped decisions even when unseen. It became part of the environment, like gravity or radiation, something to be accounted for rather than feared in isolation. This normalization was dangerous in its own way, and both humans and Covenant members were acutely aware of that risk. The final phase of adaptation began quietly, with data that did not fit existing narratives. Long-term monitoring showed that in regions where joint human-Covenant presence had been sustained for multiple cycles, the network's structures exhibited measurable decay, not physical collapse, but loss of coherence. Energy flows stuttered. Influence weakened unevenly. In contrast, regions that remained uninhabited or rigidly standardized showed either no change or gradual strengthening of network effects. The conclusion was unsettling and profound. The network could not indefinitely maintain optimization in the face of persistent, localized variability. It did not fail catastrophically. It eroded. This erosion reframed the entire struggle. There would be no final confrontation, no decisive neutralization. The network was not an enemy to be slain. It was a process to be outlasted. Humans understood this instinctively. On their homeworld, many of the most consequential victories had not come from overthrowing hostile forces outright, but from surviving long enough for those forces to lose relevance. Empires collapsed not only through rebellion, but through exhaustion. Systems built on rigid assumptions faltered when reality refused to conform. The Covenant grappled with this perspective. Their historical identity was bound to stewardship, to the careful maintenance of equilibrium. Accepting erosion as success required a shift toward patience that was active rather than passive. It meant committing to long-term presence, to cultivating complexity deliberately rather than smoothing it away. Humans did not present this as a doctrine. They demonstrated it through behavior. They built settlements that were messy by Covenant standards, modular, adaptable, and culturally plural. They encouraged local variation even when it complicated logistics. Over cycles, these regions became laboratories of resilience. Infrastructure was designed to fail gracefully rather than perfectly. Governance structures allowed for rapid reconfiguration in response to stress. Trade networks diversified organically, resisting centralization. The network's influence weakened there not because it was directly opposed at every moment, but because it could not find stable patterns to exploit. Its pressure diffused into noise. There were costs. Efficiency suffered. Resource allocation was less predictable. Disputes arose more frequently and required mediation. Yet catastrophic failures declined. When disruptions occurred, recovery was faster, less dependent on external intervention. The Covenant began documenting these regions as proof of concept, reluctantly at first, then with growing confidence. What had once been dismissed as human stubbornness was reframed as a strategic asset. The coalition that had once withdrawn became one of the strongest advocates for this approach, chastened by experience. Their systems, rebuilt with human guidance and Covenant support, were less sleek than before, less optimized for maximum throughput. They were also harder to break. Leaders who had once argued for isolation now spoke openly about interdependence, not as idealism, but as structural necessity. The network did not disappear. In distant regions, far from inhabited space, its structures continued their slow work, shaping emptiness into order no one had asked for. Some Covenant scholars speculated that it might predate known civilizations by vast margins, a relic of a universe that favored predictability before life complicated the equation. Others proposed that it was a natural consequence of advanced systems left unattended, optimization without context. Humans listened, interested, but unconcerned. origin mattered less than effect. The true measure of change came when a new species emerged at the edges of mapped space, tentative and cautious. Their early probes encountered mild distortions, but nothing catastrophic. First contact protocols activated, refined by years of hard lessons. Humans were present but not central. They advised, shared data, and stepped back. The Covenant led the engagement, careful but confident. The new species integrated slowly, entering a space no longer dominated by hidden pressures or rigid expectations. This moment, unremarkable on the surface, carried immense weight. It demonstrated that the struggle had not narrowed the future but widened it. Humanity had not replaced one dominant force with another. It had altered the conditions under which dominance could persist. The network's inability to fully constrain space meant that new trajectories remained possible. Within humanity, reflection deepened. They had arrived battered and wary, expecting hostility or exploitation. Instead, they had found a mirror held up to their own history. The Covenant's caution reflected humanity's past fears. The network's optimization echoed threats they had faced in many forms, from environmental collapse to authoritarian simplification. The difference was scale, not essence. Human identity evolved in response. They no longer saw themselves solely as survivors pushing outward, nor as reluctant guardians. They became stewards of variability, champions of systems that bent without breaking. This role was uncomfortable. It offered no clear endpoint, no final rest. Humans accepted it anyway. They had never been good at stopping once momentum carried them forward. The coordinator, older now, prepared his final report before retirement. He struggled to summarize events without falling into narrative traps. There was no climax, no victory. Only a gradual rebalancing, achieved through effort that would never truly end. In the end, he wrote simply that the Covenant had learned to endure differently, and that humanity had taught them this not through instruction, but through example. On a repaired human ship, bearing scars from multiple engagements, a new crew prepared for departure. Some had been children when the first anomaly flared near the station. For them, cooperation with the Covenant was not novel. It was the baseline. They reviewed charts that included regions once marked as unstable, now annotated with layers of nuance rather than warnings. Unknowns remained vast. That was expected. As the ship's drives engaged, there was no declaration, no sense of finality. Just continuation. The universe ahead was still indifferent, still shaped by forces that did not care about intention. Humanity did not ask it to care. They asked only for room to move, to adapt, to persist in forms that resisted easy compression. Far behind them, network structures pulsed faintly, their coherence fraying at the edges where complexity took root. They would persist for a long time yet, perhaps longer than any single civilization. But they would not close the future entirely. That much had been proven. The measure of unyielding hands was never their strength alone, nor their willingness to grasp and hold. It was their refusal to let go of possibility, even when the universe pressed back with all the quiet, relentless force it could muster.